For 19 out of every 100 genes running through some Yoruba bloodlines, scientists can't name the species they came from. Not a typo, not a rare disease marker. A completely unidentified branch of the human family tree, one that split off before Neanderthals even existed, with 0 fossils, 0 bones, 0 physical proof it ever walked the earth, except for the DNA it left behind, still alive, still passing from parent to child inside ordinary Nigerian families today. And that's just the first of 3 hidden histories scientists found buried inside Yoruba DNA that nobody, not oral tradition, not archaeology, not a single history book, ever saw coming. Here's how the discovery actually happened. Because it's not the kind of finding anyone was specifically hunting for. In 2020, geneticists Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman set out to answer a fairly technical question about West African population genetics. Did modern humans in this region carry any detectable trace of interbreeding with archaic hominins, the way populations outside Africa carry measurable Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry? That comparison had always been considered essentially impossible to run properly for African populations because scientists have no equivalent African fossil DNA to compare against. Neanderthal remains preserved well in the cold caves of Europe and Asia. Africa's hot, humid climate destroys ancient DNA far too quickly for that same kind of direct fossil comparison to work. So the researchers built a workaround. Rather than needing an actual archaic skeleton to compare against, they developed a statistical method capable of detecting the genetic fingerprint of ancient interbreeding, purely from patterns buried inside living people's genomes, without ever touching a single fossil. They ran that method against genetic data from 4 West African populations, the Yoruba of Nigeria, the Esan of Nigeria, the Mende of Sierra Leone, and the Gambian population of West Africa's western divisions. All 4 populations showed the same unmistakable signal. Somewhere between 2 and 19% of their genetic ancestry traced back to an archaic human population that split away from the rest of the human family tree before the divergence that eventually produced Neanderthals and Denisovans, meaning this wasn't simply another Neanderthal, and it wasn't a Denisovan either. It was something else entirely, a lineage science has no name for beyond the placeholder researchers now use: ghost archaic ancestry. Sit with what that actually means. Neanderthal DNA, found in the genomes of nearly everyone with ancestry outside Africa, comes from a well-documented species with recovered skeletons, skulls, and even extracted, sequenced fossil genomes that let scientists directly compare living humans against the actual ancient population in question. What Durvasula and Sankararaman found inside Yoruba DNA has no such fossil counterpart. Nobody has ever dug up a skeleton belonging to this specific archaic population. Nobody knows what they looked like, how they lived, or exactly when they went extinct as a distinct group. The only proof they ever existed at all is the genetic echo still sitting inside the DNA of people living in Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Gambia today. A population whose entire physical existence has been reconstructed backward from statistical inference rather than a single recovered bone. Sankararaman, reflecting on the finding, put it about as directly as a geneticist can put something this strange. Researchers don't actually need fossil DNA to confirm that ancient interbreeding happened somewhere deep in human ancestry. The genome itself, read carefully enough, can prove it happened on its own. That's a genuinely significant shift in how population genetics works, because it means every population on Earth, not just the ones lucky enough to have well-preserved ancient bones nearby, can potentially have its deep, hidden history read directly out of living DNA, no excavation required. the specific genetic segments involved aren't just statistical noise sitting quietly in the background. Researchers identified several genes carrying detectable signatures of this archaic introgression at unusually high frequency across the sampled populations, including NF1, a well-studied tumor suppressor gene, and MTFR2, a gene involved in mitochondrial function. Finding archaic genetic material concentrated specifically at genes tied to real active biological processes suggests this ghost ancestry didn't simply blend into the modern gene pool as inert genetic filler. Some of it may have been actively selected for, carried forward generation after generation, because it offered some kind of biological advantage to the population that inherited it. The same basic evolutionary logic that explains why certain Neanderthal-derived genes tied to immune function and skin adaptation have persisted so persistently inside non-African populations for tens of thousands of years. That specific detail, archaic DNA showing up disproportionately at genes tied to real biological function rather than scattered randomly across the genome, is exactly the kind of evidence population geneticists look for when trying to distinguish a genuinely meaningful ancient interbreeding event from simple statistical noise or modeling error. Random genetic drift alone wouldn't be expected to concentrate ancient, unrelated DNA specifically around genes doing active biological work generation after generation. Natural selection would. That pattern gives researchers real confidence that what they're looking at reflects an actual historical event. Real ancient humans from a now extinct population interbreeding with the ancestors of modern West Africans at some point in the deep past, rather than some kind of artifact produced by the statistical method itself. That's the first genuinely hidden chapter buried inside modern Yoruba DNA, an entire extinct human lineage invisible to archaeology, detectable only through genetics, quietly folded into the ancestry of tens of millions of living people who have absolutely no way of knowing it's there unless someone runs exactly this kind of specialized statistical analysis on their genome. The implications of that finding reach well beyond the 4 specific populations sampled in the original 2020 study, too. Because the Yoruba, Isan, Mende, and Gambian populations don't exist in genetic isolation from the rest of West Africa, related ghost ancestry signals have since been flagged in broader surveys of other West African populations carrying similar deep ancestral roots, suggesting this archaic lineage's genetic footprint may extend considerably further across the region than the original 4-population study alone was able to directly demonstrate. Researchers studying African population genetics increasingly suspect that Africa itself, the birthplace of every human population on Earth, likely harbors several more of these fossilist ghost lineages still waiting to be detected, simply because the continent's genetic diversity has historically received far less dedicated research attention and far fewer sequenced genomes than European and Asian populations have. The second chapter turns up in a place nobody would have thought to look for it at all: 7th century England. In 2025, a team of archaeologists and geneticists publishing in the journal Antiquity examined skeletal remains from 2 Anglo-Saxon cemeteries sitting on opposite ends of England's southern coast, one at Updown in Kent, the other at Worth Mattraverse in Dorset, roughly 200 kilometers apart. The overwhelming majority of individuals buried at both sites carried exactly the ancestry historians would expect for early medieval England. Northern European lineages, alongside West British and Irish ancestry, reflecting the region's existing population before Anglo-Saxon settlement. But one individual at each site stood out immediately once the genetic data came back. Their mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line passed down virtually unchanged from mother to child, traced back to Northern Europe, consistent with everyone else buried around them. Their broader autosomal DNA, the genetic material inherited from both parents combined, told a completely different story. 20 to 40% genetic affinity specifically with modern-day Yoruba, Menda, Mandenka, and Esan populations from sub-Saharan West Africa. Statistical modeling of exactly how that ancestry likely entered each individual's family tree pointed to something remarkably specific. Each of these two people probably had a paternal grandparent originating from the southern Sahel region of West Africa, someone who made their way to England sometime between the mid-500s and early 600s CE, a full 1,000 years before the transatlantic slave trade that most casual observers would instinctively assume explains any West African ancestry showing up anywhere in the historical record of the British Isles. This wasn't the product of colonial era or early modern contact. It traces back to the actual founding period of Anglo-Saxon England itself, centuries before England existed as anything resembling a unified kingdom. Think about what that specific family history actually required. Somewhere in the southern Sahel, a region spanning parts of what is now Mali, Niger, Chad, and northern Nigeria, a man's journey, whether through trade networks, military movement, or some other channel historians haven't yet fully reconstructed, eventually carried his lineage all the way to the southern coast of England, over 4,000 miles away, sometime in the century following the fall of the Western Roman Empire. His grandchild ended up buried in an ordinary Anglo-Saxon cemetery, alongside neighbors of overwhelmingly Northern European ancestry, with nothing in the burial itself, no distinct grave goods, no separate treatment, marking that child out as different from anyone else resting nearby. Whoever that grandchild was, their community apparently didn't treat their partial West African ancestry as grounds for exclusion from the ordinary rites and rituals of Anglo-Saxon burial. They were simply part of the community and stayed that way in death, exactly like everyone else around them. The researchers involved were careful to note that two individuals found at two separate sites roughly 200 kilometers apart, sharing the same broad genetic pattern, makes coincidence considerably less likely as an explanation than some kind of genuine, if still poorly understood, channel of contact connecting West Africa to early Anglo-Saxon England during this specific window of the 6th and 7th centuries. Exactly what that channel actually was, trade, military service, some other form of long-distance mobility historians haven't yet identified, remains an open question the research team was honest about not having fully answered. What the genetic evidence establishes beyond reasonable doubt is that the connection existed and produced real, living descendants on English soil, regardless of whether the specific mechanism behind it ever gets fully reconstructed. That finding directly contradicts centuries of assumption about how connected or disconnected early medieval Britain actually was from the rest of the world. Popular historical imagination tends to picture the period immediately following Rome's collapse as an isolated insular time in British history, cut off from meaningful long-distance contact until later medieval trade networks and eventually the age of transoceanic exploration reopened those connections centuries later. Two skeletons sitting quietly in English soil for roughly 1,400 years have now directly overturned that assumption, revealing that genuine, traceable family connections between West Africa and the southern coast of England existed considerably earlier than any historian had previously suspected, carried forward not through any documented trade route or military campaign historians already knew about, but through the far more intimate, far harder to trace channel of actual family lineage. The researchers behind the 2025 study were careful to note just how significant it is that these two individuals turned up in ordinary community cemeteries rather than anywhere suggesting unusual or marginalized treatment. Early Anglo-Saxon burial practice typically reflected a person's social standing and community belonging fairly directly. Through grave placement, orientation, and the objects buried alongside them. Finding these two individuals resting among their neighbors, without any indication of separate or unusual treatment, suggests their communities either knew about, and simply didn't treat as remarkable, their partial West African ancestry, or more likely, never had any way of identifying it at all, since a person's specific genetic ancestry several generations back isn't something visible to the naked eye in every case, especially once admixture has occurred across a couple of intervening generations. Either way, the burial evidence tells a story of ordinary community membership, not exclusion, layered on top of an ancestral connection nobody involved could have consciously tracked without the DNA sequencing technology that wouldn't exist for another 14 centuries. There's a third layer to this story, considerably more technical than the first two, but genuinely important for understanding just how much hidden complexity sits inside Yoruba ancestry specifically, separate from other closely related West African populations. A detailed 2017 study reconstructing deep African population history, published alongside a major ancient DNA dataset, found something quietly surprising when researchers compared the Yoruba against their close West African neighbors, the Menda of Sierra Leone. Despite sharing broadly similar West African ancestry and living in reasonably close geographic proximity to one another, the Yoruba showed a measurable, statistically significant excess of genetic affinity toward Eastern African populations, and even toward non-African populations more broadly, that the Menda simply didn't share to nearly the same degree. That's a subtle finding, but it points toward something genuinely important. Even within West Africa, among populations that share deep, broadly overlapping ancestry, the Yoruba specifically carry a detectable genetic signature connecting them toward the eastern side of the continent in a way their close regional neighbors don't. Researchers modeling this pattern found it wasn't consistent with any simple, single migration explanation. It required multiple separate ancient population mixing events, layered on top of each other across a long span of prehistory, to actually explain the specific genetic pattern the Yoruba carry today. The population geneticists studying this data concluded that the deep ancestral history of West Africa generally, and the Yoruba specifically, involved considerably more ancient population movement and mixing across the continent than the simpler, more static models of African population history had previously assumed. That finding matters because it complicates a common, if rarely stated out loud, assumption that African population history somehow moved less or mixed less across deep prehistory than population history elsewhere in the world did. The genetic record says the opposite. Sub-Saharan Africa, precisely because anatomically modern humans have lived there for the longest stretch of time of any inhabited continent on Earth, has had considerably more time for exactly this kind of complex, multi-layered population mixing to accumulate layer after layer across tens of thousands of years that populations on other continents simply haven't had available to them. The Yoruba's specific Eastern African genetic echo is one small detectable piece of that much longer, much deeper accumulated history, a history genetics is only now beginning to properly untangle, one carefully modeled population comparison at a time. Put these three findings together, an entire extinct fossilless human lineage folded into the genome, direct family lineage reaching all the way to 7th century England, centuries before anyone assumed that kind of contact was possible, and a deep ancestral signal connecting the Yoruba specifically toward East Africa in a way their closest West African neighbors don't share. And the picture that emerges runs directly against the simplified, static version of Yoruba history most casual accounts tend to offer. The story usually told about Yoruba origins centers on Ile-Ife. The ancient city Yoruba tradition identifies as the birthplace of their civilization, and in the deepest layers of Yoruba spiritual tradition, the literal birthplace of humanity itself, associated with the founding ancestor Oduduwa. That cultural and spiritual history is real, significant, and independently well documented through archaeology, oral tradition, and centuries of recorded Yoruba political and artistic achievement, from the sophisticated bronze and terracotta artistry of Ile-Ife itself, to the later rise of the powerful Oyo Empire. But genetics reveals that story sitting on top of a considerably deeper, considerably stranger biological history, one involving population movements, ancient interbreeding events, and family connections stretching backward and outward in directions no oral tradition or written historical record had ever described, simply because none of that deeper history was visible to anyone without the specific tools modern genome sequencing finally provides. Yoruba cultural identity, rooted in Ile-Ife and centuries of documented West African civilization, is entirely real and entirely separate from this deeper genetic layer. Both things are true simultaneously. A rich, well-documented cultural and political history reaching back many centuries, and an even older, considerably more hidden biological history reaching back tens of thousands of years, involving an extinct human population science still can't fully describe, and a family lineage that somehow made its way to the opposite side of the known world over a millennium before anyone would have expected it to be. It's worth being precise about how these two layers of history actually relate to each other, because they operate on genuinely different time scales entirely. The Ile-Ife tradition, the Oduduwa lineage, the Oyo Empire, all of it unfolds within the last 1,000 to 2,000 years of documented Yoruba history, a time frame well within reach of oral tradition, archaeological excavation, and, in the more recent centuries, written historical record. The ghost archaic ancestry, by contrast, likely dates back tens of thousands, quite possibly hundreds of thousands, of years, long before anything resembling Yoruba identity, or indeed any specific ethnic identity anywhere on Earth, had even begun to take shape. These aren't competing versions of the same history. They're two entirely different layers of the past, one recent and richly documented, the other ancient and only readable through the highly specialized tools of modern population genetics, both true at once, both real, both part of what it actually means to carry Yoruba ancestry today. There's a broader significance to all of this beyond simple historical curiosity, too, one connected directly to the Yoruba's enormous and ongoing global legacy. The Yoruba are one of Africa's largest ethnic groups, numbering somewhere between 44 and 50 million people, concentrated primarily in southwestern Nigeria, with substantial communities extending into neighboring Benin and Togo. But the Yoruba genetic and cultural footprint extends dramatically further than that population figure alone suggests, because the Bight of Benin region, the historic homeland of the Yoruba and neighboring peoples, was one of the primary points of departure during the transatlantic slave trade, meaning a substantial share of African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and Afro-Brazilians today carry significant Yoruba ancestry, often the single largest identifiable African ancestral component in their genetic makeup. For millions of people across the African diaspora, discovering Yoruba ancestry through modern DNA testing has become, for many, considerably more than a simple genealogical data point. It functions as a genuine point of connection back to a specific, identifiable civilization, language, and spiritual tradition that survived, in fragments and in full, across the brutal disruption of the slave trade and centuries of forced separation from the continent. That diaspora connection makes the hidden genetic layers uncovered by this research land differently than they might for a population without that same global reach. Millions of people across the Americas who trace part of their ancestry back to the Yoruba homeland are, whether they know it or not, also carrying fragments of that same ghost archaic lineage, that same deep Eastern African genetic echo, layered inside their own DNA, alongside everything else their specific family history added on top of it during and after the transatlantic slave trade. The hidden genetic history uncovered inside modern Yoruba populations in Nigeria isn't sealed off within Nigeria's own borders. It extends outward across the entire African diaspora, present in genomes scattered from Lagos to Bahia to New Orleans, whether or not any single individual carrying it has ever had reason to go looking for it. For someone in the diaspora taking a consumer DNA test today and seeing a Yoruba or Nigerian ancestry result appear on their screen, that single line of text carries a genuinely staggering amount of compressed history behind it, most of which no standard consumer test result will ever mention. It represents, at minimum, a documented cultural lineage stretching back to Ile-Ife and the Oyo Empire, a family history disrupted by the transatlantic slave trade within the last few centuries, a deep ancestral connection toward East Africa dating back long before any of that, and, quite possibly, a genetic trace of an entire extinct human population that science still hasn't fully identified, folded silently into the same string of genetic code. A single ancestry percentage on a screen, in other words, can represent radically different depths of history all layered on top of each other at once, most of it invisible, unless a researcher specifically goes looking for it, using exactly the right tools. What makes this particular case so genuinely remarkable, set alongside other ancestry mysteries examined through modern genetics, is how many separate, independent layers of hidden history turned out to be stacked on top of one another inside a single, well-studied population. Most population genetic stories involve uncovering one specific, surprising thread, a single migration, a single admixture event, a single unexpected connection. The Yoruba case involves at least 3 separate, independently discovered layers, an extinct hominin lineage with no fossil record at all, a documented family connection reaching an ocean away and 1,000 years into the past, and a deep ancestral signal connecting specifically toward East Africa in a way not shared by geographically similar neighboring populations, each one uncovered by a completely separate research team, using completely separate methods, published years apart from one another, and each one revealing something about Yoruba ancestry that no amount of oral tradition, archaeology, or written history had ever hinted at on its own. That layered complexity is likely far from unique to the Yoruba specifically, too. It's simply that the Yoruba happen to be one of the most extensively studied African populations in the world, included as a core reference group in major international genome projects for over 2 decades now, which means researchers have had considerably more opportunity to actually find these hidden layers than they've had with less thoroughly sequenced populations elsewhere on the continent. Every population studied with this same level of genetic depth likely carries its own comparable stack of hidden histories, ghost ancestries, unexpected long-distance family connections, deep internal population structure, invisible to casual observation, simply waiting for the right combination of sample size, statistical method, and researcher curiosity to bring it into view. The Yoruba just happen to be one of the first and most thoroughly documented examples of exactly how much can be sitting there once someone finally goes looking properly. If a story like this, where a population's own DNA turns out to hold entire chapters of hidden history invisible to every other historical method available, is the kind that stays with you, this exact pattern keeps showing up again and again across population genetics research all over the world, every time researchers get the chance to look closely enough at a population's genome to see past everything already written down about them. And if there's a specific population, region, or ancestry mystery you've always wanted properly examined against the real evidence, drop it below, because that's exactly where the next one of these comes from.